please.
Well, thank you, Martin, for hosting us today for this OASIS lunchtime talk in these newly relaunched meetings, and great to see such an impressive turnout today. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing David shortly. But before I do that, it's a great pleasure to welcome to OASIS Sally Fraser, the new workplace chaplain Scotland, who is, his remit is within the Edinburgh City Centre, specifically with Edinburgh City Centre churches together. That's ourselves, St Cuthbert's, our neighbours, St John's and St Andrews and St George's West down on George Street. Sally's already ensconced in St Cuthbert's in the tower in her office, and is also already using the Melrose room as a meeting room, which is excellent news. So over to you, Sally, just to say hello to everyone and to introduce yourself, please.
Hi there, yeah, my name's Sally. I'm really pleased to see you all, and I look forward to getting to know you over the next while, and hopefully in person at some stage. But it's really nice to see all your faces. I'm really excited to be the new workplace chaplain. It's it would feel a real privilege at any time, but just at this particular time, when there is such a need for people to just maybe let off a bit of steam. There's a sense when you're out talking to people of a lot has been held in for a long time, and I suppose that's my hope over the next while, that as church communities and faith communities, that that we would give people spaces to be able to put some of those feelings that they've been storing up and holding together, and that we'd be able to sort of share a little bit of our strength with people. And so looking forward to working with all of you, really, to think of ways to do that, and also to reach out to new people, and yeah, and to be supporting people where they are, which is, you know, in their workplaces. So if anyone has, I look forward to hearing from any of you who might have ideas or whatever, and to getting to know you over the next while. So thank you.
Well, thanks to Sally, and great to have her with us. Just one quick bit of housekeeping. Apart from Martin and obviously David, could everyone else please mute themselves until the questions now? So I hand over to Martin to introduce David. Martin.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome to everybody. I see we've just been joined by John and Kerry and Andy. So lovely to have everybody joining us, and Sheila's also on, and Robert and John. So a good cross-section of people living in and around the city centre. So it's my pleasure to welcome David on everyone's behalf. The title of his talk is "What Good is Prison?" As far as I know, David is probably the most qualified person in Scotland to speak with authority on the prison service, and therefore we're delighted to have David with us. David enjoyed a 38-year career in justice, firstly in policing and then in prisons. He spent 18 years in the Metropolitan Police in London before transferring back to Scotland, where he was the Chief Constable, firstly of Dumfries and Galloway, and then Lothian and Borders Police. He was the last Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders Police before the formation of Police Service of Scotland in 2013. He then spent 5 years as Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland, inspecting 15 prisons in Scotland. Recently, he's conducted an independent inquiry into mental health services in Tayside, another topical subject which comes up during elections. So you can tell from that brief summary, David held some very senior and important appointments in the police service and prisons, but he's also a people person, which is why I'm delighted on your behalf to invite David to speak to us now on what good is prison. Over to you, David, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much indeed, Martin, for that generous introduction. You'll have heard Martin earlier saying that I'd been asked to speak for about 20 minutes or so. That's not entirely accurate. I've been asked to speak for 23 minutes. Martin, in impeccable organization, has sent me a timetable which says I begin speaking at 12:37, and so I think Martin's got it right to the absolute minute. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you. I will speak until about 1 o'clock, and then very happy to hear your own views of what I've said and to answer any questions. I want to ask you, do you know how many people are in prison in Scotland today? I wonder how many, if you think of a number, and I'm about to tell you the answer, and it'll be interesting, well, it may be interesting for you to know if you've guessed too high or too low. As of last Friday, the 23rd of April, there were 7,355 people in prisons in Scotland. That's a bit down on how many were in last year. I think the COVID impact has reduced the prison population. Last year there were on average about 8,200. So we're talking about the population of a town somewhere between Brecon in Angus or Peebles in the Borders. So if you're familiar with either of those, that is the number of people that we have in our prisons. Now, my next question is that a good number? Do you think that's too high or too low? Are you reassured that dangerous criminals are locked up? Or are you horrified that we incarcerate so many people in Scotland? Well, let me tell you what I think the answer to that question is, which is, I think it's a lot, and I also think it's too many. And let me tell you why. But to begin with, I want to talk about comparisons with other countries. The way of measuring population is per 100,000. And you may be, I hope you'll be surprised to hear that Scotland imprisons the highest number of any country in Europe. So on that measure of per 100,000, we on average imprison 145 per 100,000. Now the European average is about 100, so we're about 50% over the European average. England and Wales is about 140, and the Scandinavian countries are much lower at about 50 or 60. So you can see that we're more than double the lowest level of imprisonment and 50% above the average. If you want a little bit of comfort, looking out with Europe at 300, so twice as high as us as the country of Russia, and the highest country in the world with 700 per 100,000 is, and you may not be surprised to hear this, the United States of America. But my question, which I set us this lunchtime, is what good is prison? And to answer that question, what good is prison? I think we need to begin with a pre-question, which is, what is prison for? Why do we send people to prison? It's part of our criminal justice system. Why should people go to prison? And I wonder how you would answer that. As I ask that question, what's prison for? I wonder what you would say. And I can think of 4 things you might say, and certainly 4 things that other people have said. The first thing they would say is that it is as a punishment. So the law dictates what you can and cannot do. And there are things like you cannot steal, you cannot assault someone, you cannot murder people, you cannot rape. And the law says that if you're convicted of those crimes in a court, then you may be sentenced. So that's a punishment. And at the lowest level, that might be a fine or a community order, or for serious offences, it's a punishment. So it's a recognition, it's a response to your having offended and caused harm. So punishment is one reason. The second reason you might say is that it's a deterrence. It's to put you off committing crime. The idea being that the fear of prison will frighten people into not offending. So it sits there as a deterrence. And when you're parking your car on a yellow line or not paying in the meter, does the fear of a fine, a fixed penalty notice, change your behavior? Without a doubt, for some it does. So punishment was the first reason, deterrence the second, and rehabilitation is the third. So we send, some people argue that we should send people to prison to make them change, to give them an opportunity to learn new skills, that the short, sharp shock of a prison sentence might lead to some form of rehabilitation. And the fourth reason is to protect the public. So clearly some people in Scotland who have committed serious crimes, and perhaps many crimes, are a danger and cause potential harm to the public generally. So we imprison people to protect the public. So those are four things you might have said. There are other reasons too that you might think of. Now, in my view, the only real valid reason is that last one of protecting the public from harm. And let me explain a bit more why I say that. So the act of imprisoning someone, sending them into prison, intrinsically does a lot of harm and damage in itself. And I think that's something we should be aware of, that it's not a cost-free option when it comes to sentencing. And the very notion symbolically of removing someone from the community, taking them away from where they live and work, and put them into a closed institution is a symbolic sense of our response as a society to serious offending, that we take them out of the community and put them into prison. But if you think about that more widely, that causes damage to relationships, so any supportive friends, perhaps in the family. It's certainly not good for people's mental health being in prison. Prison is not a healthy place to be. People will often lose their accommodation, the tenancy in their flat. If they had a job, they may well lose their job and leave prison unemployed. And there's a sense that it's a really unproductive way for often many young men to be spending months incarcerated in prison. And I mentioned about cost. I was thinking of other costs, but it's also expensive. So each prison place costs us about £35,000 to £40,000 a year. So I think we need to recognize that there are harmful side effects. I don't think any of those are by design, apart from perhaps the removing from community. But the consequences of imprisonment are quite serious and long-lasting. Now, there are positive reasons for imprisonment, and I said to prevent serious offenders from being in the community. And depending on people's lifestyle before they go into prison, particularly if they have addictions, there are some positive benefits because they've got access to healthcare in prison, and to shelter if they were homeless, and to meals and so on. So, and those aren't designed by the judge when sentencing, but those are things that we provide and offer to people in prison as part of their human rights, because they don't lose their human rights on imprisonment. Although until recently they lost their right to vote, and we might come back to that. I think I'm particularly critical of short prison sentences. And not because I'm in favor of longer prison sentences, but just I think that the damage that a short prison sentence does, and the good that it doesn't do. So some people will think that, well, if you send someone to prison for a short sentence, that will be a wake-up call to them. They'll then change their ways. But the reality is that people who serve short sentences and then are released, so I'm talking about 6, 12, 18-month sentences, the reoffending rate is very high. So it self-evidently does not stop people from offending again. I think that, well, the figures vary, but it's something like 60% of people released from prison are reconvicted within 2 years. So anyone who argued that imprisonment was a deterrence, it may be for you and me who have never been in prison, but for those who have been through the criminal justice system, and a lot of people in prison have been in and out of prison. There's a revolving door that's talked about. So clearly for them, it is not an effective deterrence. Now, in some sense, it's a deterrence because if you speak to people in prison, they would rather not be there. They sometimes will regret the crime they committed. They will more frequently regret that they've been caught for it. And once people are in the system, it is difficult to break the cycle, and that's why there is such a high level of reoffending. And there are perhaps some good reasons for that. If people have, if their family life is broken up, if they have lost a job, or if they were unemployed in the first place, it is very difficult. We put up barriers to people to rehabilitate, to get a job after they've left prison. If you're an employer and you've got two what look like suitable candidates, and one has a prison sentence, I can imagine just quite naturally you would be wary of taking that person on, think they might be dishonest or violent. But it is so we put up barriers to people to break that cycle of offending. As Martin said in his introduction, I spent 5 years inspecting prisons as Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland, and I saw I saw many people in prison in that time, and a good number of them are themselves victims of crime. I think particularly of women in prison, who often have themselves been victims of crime, victims of trauma, abuse, physical, psychological, sexual abuse. And so many people are have addiction problems, alcohol and drugs. I think about 2/3 of people will say they were under the influence either of drugs or alcohol at the time of committing the offence. Now, I'm not going to put a moral judgment on that either way, and some people say, well, that's their own fault and they shouldn't have indulged in that way. But without a doubt, it's a serious problem within prisons, and I haven't got the figures now for the percentage of people on a daily methadone script, but it's very high in prison. And linked with addictions are mental health problems. And I was shocked at the level of mental ill health that I saw in prison. Now, clearly, if you were locked up in a concrete cell for 20 hours a day, it would not be good for your mental health. That's why I say prison is not a healthy place. And you would undoubtedly suffer stress and depression and other mental ill health. But I'm also talking much more about serious mental ill health, psychosis, schizophrenia, and so on. Now, there is a state hospital at Carstairs that it's a hospital and not a prison, although it would feel very much like a prison in one sense, because people are many dangerous people are incarcerated there and are not free to leave. But there are also many people still being cared for by the prison service who have serious mental health problems. Now, what I would say about my years of inspecting prisons was that I have huge admiration for people who work in prison. So the prison governors, the prison officers, the chaplains, the health care providers, the education. There's hundreds of people dedicated to doing their best for prisons, and with very few exceptions, I would say that the vast majority of people working in prison want to do the best that they can. Now, the road ahead for people in prison varies very much from whether they're just in for a short sentence of 12 months or a year, or if someone's in serving a minimum of 20-year sentence. But in most cases, the vast majority of people are released either at the end of a long sentence or after a brief sentence. So the journey is always looking to release people and prepare them for going back into the community. And there are huge efforts made to address some of these complicated problems and challenges that people have. So in the months running up to someone's release from prison, their liberation, then efforts will be made to try and break that cycle of offending. So often in the past, and still happens today, on a Friday, which is the day that most prisoners are released, because if their sentence is due to end on a Saturday or a Sunday, they can't be held onto the Monday, or that would be unlawful detention. So they're released on a Friday. And on that day, things might be set up. They might be going back to a home and a loving family and resources, but often they'll be returning perhaps to, well, certainly to unemployment, but returning to homelessness if they don't have accommodation, or at best into a hostel, which often isn't conducive. If they have addiction problems, they maybe have to go to register at a GP. So you find that someone maybe has to attend 3 offices on their day of liberation: the GP to register for prescription, the housing office to register as homeless to go on the housing list, and at the job centre to apply for benefits. So recognizing that is a common problem for people leaving prison, then a lot of work is done on trying to support them in the months before release, to link them up with either statutory sector social work, or through a third sector charity organisation to support them to find accommodation and support them with health and finance. So that's in preparation for release. But before that, a lot of work is done in prison in addressing some of their needs. So there are offender programs, I suppose most notably for violent and sexual offenders. And then every prison has an education department. And so there are some really good initiatives in teaching, particularly literacy, if people are struggling to read, but all sorts of wider skills. And then preparation for employment. So at each workshop, at each prison, you'll have workshops, so people will learn plumbing or bricklaying or IT skills and so on, as part of doing our best to write a different story. And there are many stories of success, because for people being in imprisonment, it's a time for reflection. Often they are bitterly disappointed with themselves, not just in as I sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek said, that they were caught, but they realize that they've done harm to the victim. They've maybe harmed their personal relationships. It's not how they wanted their life to be. And so for some people, just having that time does provide an opportunity for rehabilitation and a fresh start. Doesn't make it a good reason to send someone to prison, but it is sometimes a good thing that can happen while they're in prison. So what do I think are some of the solutions? I think we need to have well-run prisons for the smaller number of violent and serious offenders who need to be incarcerated. But I think we should be putting much more emphasis on to preventing crime in the first place. And there have been quite a growth in youth initiatives, so that, I mean, we could see that the precursors, particularly people not succeeding in education, and if they're excluded from school, we know that that's a high-risk group. High risk of getting involved in substance misuse, alcohol and drugs, high risk of offending and into the children's hearing and into the criminal court system. But for those who are in the system, I think there's much more scope for dealing with what are called alternatives to imprisonment, so community sentencing, which are much more constructive and much less harmful. And actually calling them alternatives to prison is the wrong thinking. Our first thought should be, are there community disposals that are possible? And then only if not, then an alternative to a community sentence as imprisonment might be. So I think we should be investing more in those community disposals and diversion from offending in the first place. So a week today, we all have a vote, and I'm not going to tell you how I think you should vote, but you should vote wisely and look at the policies on justice and to see how committed the parties are to modernizing our criminal justice system and to reducing the number of people who are incarcerated. Thank you very much indeed, Martin, and I hand back to you.
Well, thank you, David. You covered a range of fascinating subjects there with authority, and I'm not going to dive in with a question. I've got a couple of questions in mind. If people would like to ask a question, just come off mute and give me a little wave. Kerry is ready to ask a question because she's put her hand up. So Kerry is a working man, and after Kerry, we'll go to Howard. So Kerry first. Come off mute, Kerry. Thank you.
Hi there. Hi. Sorry, this is going to be really speedy because I've got another meeting in 2 minutes. You wouldn't believe how busy you can be even if you never leave your own living room these days. I'm not sure that working from home is a good thing. First of all, thanks so much for that. That was an amazing talk and really illuminating. That was just brilliant. Really enjoyed it. I was just really interested about the sort of women in prison. Really, I just wanted to ask a really quick question. I'm interested as well what you said about short prison sentences, because I read something a couple of years ago about someone saying how women, are sent to prison for say 3 months or something, and how it's almost completely pointless because, like as you've already said, it destroys their lives. They come back, they've lost their home, children have been taken off them, don't have a job anymore, and what was the point of all of that, really? For a short prison sentence, was it really worth it, for them to lose their home and their children? And and just sort of rates of, I know there's few women in prison, but sort of what's your thoughts on sort of helping women and shorter prison sentences, really, sort of going forward?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for your kind comments. So I looked at, as you could tell, I looked at the figures for last Friday, and there were 290 women in prison. So it's a tiny minority of the prison population. And the only good is they get access to, they get access to protection. Because often women in the community who are offending are under the control of often a violent man. And so there is a sense that they can be protected, they will get good health care, and are less likely to be victims of crime while they're in prison. So what prisons should be doing, and they do try, is to address the underlying needs. So if they have addictions, then they can get started into addiction support, either through medication or counselling, whatever. And but all I can say is I agree with you that sending a woman to prison for 3 months, what will be in the sheriff's mind might be, so let's say a woman was a persistent shoplifter. The sheriffs feel under pressure to do something about it, and they'll often talk about respite for the community. So if someone's causing antisocial behavior, then at least sending them to prison will give respite for 3 months to that shop or the community. I can understand is true, but my argument is a longer term one. In 6 months' time, you'll have made things worse because that person will be more likely to reoffend. So I still stand by the uselessness of, or the harm of, short sentences, and support alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry.
You.
Thank you, David. No, Howard's going to go next, and then I've seen some hands up. So to give you the order, Howard will go next, then it'll be Alison McNabb, and then Andy, and then Maggie. So Maggie, you can put your hand down. I've caught it. So over to you, Howard, for your clever question, please.
Well, David, may I say, I really bow to your knowledge, your experience, and above all, what shines through for me is your complete sincerity about this matter. And I think they're very valued aspects. Now, I did say that I was a bit dinosauric, and as a person in their 70s, I have these entrenched views that I suppose I was brought up with. I certainly don't advocate a return to the Count of Monte Cristo, flinging somebody in a cell and forgetting about them forever. I know that we've risen above that. But there's a kind of Christian thing about an eye for an eye, that still resonates with me. And with all your talk, you've never once mentioned the victims of any of these crimes, which maybe we're not here to talk about. But I just wonder if we have too much emphasis on the perpetrators and completely forgetting about the victims. I mean, when I was brought up, Borstals were in view, and I was terrified of ever going to any sort of system like that. Is there a fear of people now to, is the fear gone? That's possibly one of the things. Are we too, I'm almost hesitant to say it, are we too soft now with the people?
Right, thanks for those questions. I thought there was going to be a but coming when you said that you recognise my experience. So I mean, just for the record, I did mention victims. I said that the purpose of imprisonment in my mind was to prevent harm to victims of crime, and I also said that prisoners often reflect on the harm and the damage that they've done to victims, and my 33 years in the police service was all about trying to prevent crime and reduce the number of victims. I note your comment about an eye for an eye, but I think a much more sort of productive Christian notion is the one of second chance and beginning again and being forgiven and not writing people off. No, I think the more fearful a prison environment is, the less likely it is to have its effect of being a deterrence. I think one of the dangers of prison is brutalizing, not perhaps by the staff, but by the other prisoners. It's a cold place. People can't show their emotions for weakness. And I think if you spent a month in prison, you wouldn't think this is soft. I get occasionally overstating it. Journalists will say, oh, prison's now like a 5-star hotel. And that tells me two things. One is that they've never been in a prison. And secondly, that they've never been in a 5-star hotel.
Thanks, David. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that exchange, Howard and David. So we'll go to our next question, which is Alison McNabb. Alison, please go ahead to your question for David.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, David. That was a really interesting talk. I'm interested in your thoughts around the use of remand, and particularly in light of COVID and delays within the criminal justice system. I noticed there was some press coverage this morning around this in a report from Scottish Government, or statistics from Scottish Government, showing the percentage of those prisoners who are held on remand and subsequently not kept within prison, and I think that's in the region of about 55%. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts around that, as I say, particularly in light of COVID and delays, and therefore, impacts on the remand population.
Thanks very much, and that's clearly a well-informed question. I didn't mention remand. I'm chairing an advisory group at the moment for the Scottish Government on justice reform, because what happened in March last year was that the courts closed down and some people were released from prison, but the remand population is up at about 1,800, which is very high. And as you say, probably over half the people who are on remand do not subsequently go on to serve a custodial sentence. You said 55. I think the figures I remember about women was it was almost as high as 70%. And that was for two reasons. One is perhaps the case was dropped or they were acquitted, so were not convicted, or else that the time that they'd spent on remand covered the length of the sentence. So again, you won't be surprised to know that I say that I think that far too many people are on remand, and it's been exacerbated by COVID. But what we should be doing is there are alternatives. So there's something called electronic monitoring or a tag, and that can keep control of people. There are bail hostels, bail supervision. So I think again, inevitably being slightly critical of the courts and sheriffs, but I think they remand people too quickly when there are alternatives, or there should be alternatives right across Scotland to support people in the community awaiting their trial. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, David. So to go on to Andy, if Andy remembers his question from a while back. Andy, come off mute, please. Thank you.
No, I was going to ask about remand as well, so I'm very glad that that has been covered. But how do you think we can better enable and better support people with initiatives like Through Care?
There are organisations, so organisations like SACRO and Access to Industry and so on, Apex Scotland, work with people as they come out of prison. They'll maybe meet up with them in prison before release and then support them. And there are, so Bethany have something called Connect Community, used to be called Caring for Ex-Offenders, and that links churches with prisons, so that if someone is leaving prison and doesn't have support, personal support and contacts, then Connect Community is a possibility. But it's just really practical things like helping someone set up in a flat, helping them if getting employment. Because one of the problems, and people will know there's a general comment about unemployment, is that it doesn't, you have nothing to do. And I know a lot of people have been suffering mental ill health through the lockdown by the fact that they're stuck in front of a computer if they're at work, or they can't see people, and people have really missed that social contact and social connection, which I think we're all looking forward to over the next few months. So just spending time with someone who's left prison, giving them something to do, take them for a coffee, go for a walk, all of those things I think are can be helpful in supporting someone as they leave prison. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Andy. We're going to go to Maggie, and then after that it will be Felicity, David, and our last question on this session will be with Sally. So over to Maggie, please. Oh, and Jeanette.
Martin, I'll just say I don't know what your rules are. I mean, I'm happy to stay on if people want to stay on and ask me questions. So that's
firstly, thank you for that kind offer. You've obviously generated huge interest. So what I suggest we do, folks, if you do have to drop out, because I know some of you are on official lunch breaks, just quietly go. And with David's kind offer there, we will continue, because I can see several more hands have gone up, and it would be really good to get the questions, because most of us, just to make a number, most of us do encounter ex-prisoners.
Yeah.
My window cleaners here are ex-prisoners. There's a couple of local firms here in Davis and Mains who make a point of employing ex-prisoners, and they deserve a second chance. So I'm delighted that ex-prisoners very kindly come and wash the windows once a month, and so on and so forth. Right, that said, let's go over to Maggie's question, please.
Right. Well, thank you, David, for a fascinating talk, as I knew it would be. Funnily enough, what Martin said, I can resonate with that, the prisoners I usually came in touch with most, or ex-cons, were usually had drug-related narcotics problems or possibly mental health. But is there a correlation between this, where the highest in Europe, the highest rate of imprisonment in Europe? Is there a correlation with that and the fact that Scotland has a major problem with narcotics?
Undoubtedly, and I don't say one or the other which causes which, but there's another big link that we haven't talked about, which is poverty. So the vast majority of people in Scotland's prisons come from the poorest areas of Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee. But I think I think it's sharp of you to point to, because I mean we've had headlines about the drugs capital of Europe, and I think Dundee has the highest death rate through drugs, and I mean drug deaths I think are particularly harrowing, because it's impossible to know what was in the person's mind. So whether it was an accidental overdose, whether it was a suicide because they intended to, or whether they were just reckless as to whether they live or not. But I mean, for me, that speaks of such hopelessness. And, you know, if offending and in and out of prison is a cycle that's hard to break, we know that addiction to serious crime is a very difficult cycle to break. And so I think all of these are connected, and this is where I would be advocating our politicians to tackle those social injustices. You know, why is it that you know, someone born in Bearsden and growing up there has something like 12-year longer life expectancy than someone born in Drumchapel, which is 2 miles away, and that's been true for 50 years and is still true today. So for me, about tackling those issues about education and health at an early age, you know, that there was someone I knew, a police officer, head of the violence reduction unit, said that the most important 4 years in a person's life is up to their 3rd birthday. You know, and I think there needs to be a lot of support for mothers and families at that very early stage, because I mean, anyone who's worked in social work or teaching 5-year-olds will know there's a massive disparity, and of course those differences lead into life opportunities, and whether it's education and employment and sort of financial outcomes, or through health and mental health, or through offending. So you're absolutely right that they're all linked. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just my husband worked in it was a primary teacher in 2 urban deprived areas, and sadly I can think of 2 children who we had on school trips who were lovely children and who are both dead now because of drugs, and it is just tragic. And one was also up for attempted murder, and it's tragic, an absolute tragedy. So thank you.
Thanks, Maggie.
You underline the point, Maggie, just how important trying to help people to get back into some sort of life. But as David's painted the picture, it is very difficult unless you've got a friend or someone's going to support you. We're now going to go to Felicity. After that, it'll be David, Sally, and Jeanette. So over to Felicity, please.
Hello, thank you. First of all, I've put into the chat links to a couple of really eye-opening and interesting podcasts about prison that, you know, will dispel any ideas that prison is like a 5-star hotel. And actually, David, I think you've answered my question that I was going to ask, which was if I was speaking to prospective MP or MSP, what would be the issue that, you know, we can try and skewer them with on prison reform or prison, but I think, you know, it's addressing the social justice or injustice issues, isn't it?
One of my frustrations over the years has been in conversations with senior politicians, they will agree with everything I've said, but when it gets to the public, you know, there's this left, right, hard, soft, and they fear because justice and crime and law and order is more politicized here, that they are then frightened of putting forward radical proposals So the other big debate, not really wanting to open it up, but is the whole approach to drugs legislation, whether you decriminalize or and they won't enter that publicly because they're seen as such a backlash that if you're seen to be soft on drugs, you're soft on crime. Whereas I know someone commented about social justice. I think James McLean was in Scandinavia, but also I understand in most Scandinavian countries, justice for some reason isn't a great big political issue. It isn't left and right. Whereas in the United States, of course, being supremely a two-party system, you have them ratcheting up, and so you end up with someone being sentenced to 140 years imprisonment, which I doubt we'll see through the sentence. So, and their law and order and penal policy is hugely divisive, and that's why I think you've got a much greater imprisonment rate in the States. So I think we should be trying to develop consensus on, nothing I've said is particularly controversial at all. People might disagree with me about short sentences, but the notion of investing in our most vulnerable children so they have better outcomes in life is surely incontrovertible.
When I've worked at with solicitors, and just the chaotic lifestyle that these people have, and also we're down in the borders and everybody knows everybody, and even if people move to the next town, you can't get out of those networks. You have to move out.
Well, and just talking about chaotic, if someone's on a drug treatment and they don't turn up for a couple of appointments, what happens? Well, no one comes out and meets them, doesn't go to their house and say, come on, you need to come to your appointment. Actually, they get struck off. They said, oh, failed to appear, FTA, and I'll get rid of them off my books. And those are the most vulnerable people that are probably doing the most harm to victims I was concerned about. So, we need a radical rethinking to those sort of cases you're talking about, Felicity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity, and thank you, David. We have 3 more questions, and so we're going to go to David Todd, who's our arts chaplain. And I imagine, David, in the theatre world, you have 1 or 2 less than perfect people. Would that be right?
I couldn't possibly comment. What I really wanted to ask David was about reoffending. I worked as part of my training at Polmont Young Offenders, and I very much agree with your analysis of why we think people should be in prison. And I very much agree that really protecting society is the only real reason, and the others, a community order, would be better. My experience at Polmont was that very few young offenders are really bad. They're mostly mad or sad, but very few of them are inherently evil. And probably only the really evil ones should be locked up, and the others would benefit from community order. But what was really striking at Polmont was the level of reoffending. And I did see a documentary quite recently about a scheme of a sort of mentoring buddy scheme, which involved ex-cons and social workers looking after young offenders, particularly when they're released, and making sure they get to appointments and they get to their parole and that sort of thing. And that was started in Scotland and inspired prisons in England and Wales to follow. And can you tell us any more about that and whether that is actually reducing the reoffending?
Right, thanks very much, David. I'm slightly disappointed you didn't sing your question. I thought, being the arts chaplain, you might have. But of course, I remember meeting you in Polmont, so I can confirm to everyone else that what David said. And as well as being struck by their needs, I think the other thing often striking you when you go to a young offenders institution is how young they are, and we still have some 16 and 17-year-olds, despite the international, the UN rights of the child, that someone under 18 should be treated as a child, but our legislation hasn't caught up with that. There are a couple of things that struck me. One was learning about bereavements of young people in prison, and there was some research done at Polmont which found that people in Pullman had something like 5 times the level of bereavement of the average of children in Scotland. And not just, you know, an aunt or a granny who had died, but often a close member of the family who had in some way died violently, either through a drugs death or an accidental death or being murdered. So that was particularly high. So you will have heard elsewhere about what are called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, ACE, and young people in Pullman have, without doubt, suffered adverse childhood experiences. So that includes abuse that they have received or been in the house where there's domestic abuse. But there's been a lot of work done on brain development and neurodevelopment to show that people who have suffered trauma in these ways, their brains develop differently and they're not good at regulating their behavior, so they're very impulsive. And I think there's huge social pressure. I mean, even to try and get the young men to be involved in the schemes or in the programs. You know, if they think that their peers will mock them or criticize them, then they don't take part. Just very briefly then, I agree completely with mentoring. And often when you speak to someone who's been through the system, often some people who are mentors themselves will say that what made a difference for me was finding someone, an older person who had belief in me, didn't write me off, because they've been written off by everyone from teachers to, you know, the criminal justice system, oh, you're no good, you've got, you know, hopeless. And that whole notion about a second chance. And what it takes is for someone like a mentor, often peer mentors, to just walk with them and say, look, I believe in you and I'll stick with you. And then they prove, and often a young person will test, you know, if someone says that, they'll then behave badly just to test it. And I think it's very powerful, that personal relationship, that one-to-one intervention. So I think it does work. Thank you, David.
Yeah, my experience was that the younger ones reoffended more than the older ones, and very often when they got home, it was so chaotic that they'd more or less reoffended before they'd enjoyed any freedom, and some of them reoffended in order to get back into prison, because prison was a safe place. They got 3 meals a day, they got a uniform to wear, they were clean, and they were safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some very interesting points there from both of you, so thank you for that. So our penultimate question will be asked by our City Centre chaplain, Sally, who's actually going to set up a listening post. So you might just briefly mention that, Sally, just in case we have some previous prisoners, passers-by. So go ahead, please, Sally. And then the last question today will be from Jeanette. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks. Yeah, we are hoping to set up a listening post to give people the opportunity to talk. And I suppose my experience, one of my experiences that's led to the understanding the value of that is part of what my question's about, because I've done a lot of work on the streets, chatting to people who are homeless and are in addiction, and very much on the other side of that revolving door you talk about. And it is a sense of just going in and out of, you know, from hostel to prison to hostel to prison. My question was about if you have any thoughts on what we can do as people of faith and churches to kind of give a sense of continuity, because I'm quite struck when I'm speaking to people that often they've had, when they've been in church, they've enjoyed the chaplaincy and they may have been to services. And, you know,
in prison, you mean?
Pardon? In prison, sorry.
You mean
yeah.
in prison, yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned that lovely idea of new beginnings, but I remember one gentleman telling me about how he'd read the story of the prodigal son in solitary confinement, you know, and that had a really powerful effect on him. But it feels a bit like when people are in prison, they may have gone along to church services and had chaplaincy, and then when they come out, that there's no continuity with that. And I wondered if you felt there was anything we could be doing to try and, you know, create that continuity.
So yeah, I think that's important, and certainly the chaplaincy, you do listen to people, but everyone gets the opportunity to speak to a chaplain on their admission. And I mean, often they say, no, I'm not interested, but often they will, and that will be a valuable conversation. I think I mentioned earlier about Connect the Community, which is a Bethany-run service, and what they do is they match up. So someone, they'll make an offer to people leaving prison in Scotland to say, and it maybe comes through either a prison officer referral or through the chaplain. If someone has said, I would like to link up with to get some support through a church, then they'll make that link, and then someone will be designated as the befriender, and I think they meet them before the Liberation Day, and then we'll meet them at the gate on the day. And the idea being that provides some sort of support and purpose, and perhaps linked to a church. But I mean, the other thing about the meals at St Cuthbert's, and I'm at a church called Mustard Seed, which meets in Easter Road, and we provide a soul food meal a couple of times a week. And it's just, the churches can be places of welcome, and you'll know, spoken to people begging on the street, that how many people will spit at them or swear at them as they go past, and they're made to feel worthless. And I think what these unconditional meals that are offered right across Edinburgh, and I know the nuns in Lauriston Place do the same, that it's people aren't judged, they're just welcomed in there, and depending on the time and the number of volunteers and so on, then that's an opportunity for listening to people's stories, and depending what the needs are. I mean, at our soul food meals, we clearly can't solve everyone's problems, but we can refer them on to the Access EP practice or whatever particular needs they have. But we often have clothes and sleeping bags and things like that. Now, none of those is going to solve the problem of homelessness, but it is showing some sort of love and care and concern for people who don't feel or don't experience much of that. So I think there's a huge role for the church to, unconditionally to reach out to people in those sort of practical ways that are really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for your question, and we wish you well with the listening post. You may well get people of former prisoners passing by. Everyone wants a friend to tell their story to. So for our last question, Jeanette, over to you, please. Thank you, Jeanette.
Hello, thanks very much for your talk today. It reminded me a number of years ago, I worked in Peterhead, Berlin, and in Polmont in the prison welfare service there. One of the things that we used to have to do was the background reports for everybody. And the thing that's remained with me all my life is the kind of background reports that came in, where, 95% at least of the people came from such deprived backgrounds, such abuse. I used to wonder how we had so many sane people even in prison, anywhere else. We have a mental health problem. There were so many mental health problems that was just put in prison because they had nowhere else to go with them, because the mental health places were overwhelmed. Some of the prison officers were so good. There was the special unit in Berlin, where the likes of Jimmy Boyle and that, who has come out of it. I wondered, were there still the special units going like that? Also, we have even in our church, just similar to what you're doing, David, we have the Steps to Hope, where people from very deprived backgrounds, it's just a place where they can belong, and are listened to, where they can get food, but it's more the sort of company for everybody, which they wouldn't have, because they're like the fringe dwellers of society, is the only way I can describe it to you.
Yeah, well, I know Richie from Steps to Hope. I think they do a great work. I think so. I mean, it's interesting your experiences in prison, and I think David also mentioned that some people are happy to go back into prison because they know they'll get cared for and meals and so on. And you can understand that from a homeless person, perhaps. But is that not an indictment of our society? Why are we not providing support for people with addictions, poor mental health, homeless? At the moment, somehow our default position is, well, the criminal justice system, the police will pick them up and courts will sentence them, and the prison will provide that care. And I mean, often prison officers describe, well, I used to describe policing as the sort of safety net of society when people fall through the cracks. But actually, we as the police handed them on to the prisons, and it's the prisons that actually provide that life-saving care and genuine. I mean, you speak to nursing staff and doctors who work in prison, they save people's lives without a doubt. But it shouldn't be. It's a very expensive. I said £35,000 a year for each place in a prison. And just on the special unit, they don't have special units now, but I think the sorts of things that were offered, and it was about art and creativity, music, and so on, is more generally offered right across all the prisons. I think there was, I mean, the special units to stop before I started inspecting, but there was I think they had become sort of a bit of an elite group that people were trying to compete to get into. So I know that was, I mean, there were people who advocated for continuing, but they don't exist. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Jeanette, for the last question, and thank you everyone for all your questions. David, you've done remarkably well, if I may say so, in covering such a range of subjects. You and I like statistics. We shared a few. We peaked at 27 people listening to you, and you still have over 20 listening, even though we've been going strong with this question and answer session. But if nothing else, it shows that people do care about what goes on in our prison. And I think a number of us here, in one way or other, may well be engaged in helping people either stopping going to prison, if we can get the relationships that Jeanette was speaking on with Steps to Hope, the sort of work that David Todd and the other chaplains on this call do. So thank you very much indeed for a splendid lunchtime presentation. You've certainly excited our imagination. If I do get a chance to speak to any of the politicians, I will ask them to take you on as the special advisor for prisons, and hopefully you'll get paid for it as well, because you cover all the subjects admirably and you have a wonderful way of explaining things, and we thank you very much for that. So we're not able to applaud properly, but we can all give a few symbols of applause, and our biggest thanks to you, David, for your preparation and thinking these things through, and also for your years of service, which is absolutely wonderful. So thank you for that. For everybody, including David, our next meeting, last Thursday of the month, will be the 27th of May. A very interesting subject, something of a contrast today. It's called, the presenters presenting on the Museum of Mistakes, the Museum of Mistakes. So a different sort of subject for us from today. But again, thank you all for joining us. Most of you have got my emails. If anybody wants a listening ear,